Welcome, I'm Nick Shaver. I'm here with TorchPrep, and we're tackling question number 41 on test 3. So I want you to pause the video and go read question number 41 before we unpack it. Okay, so first of all, when you read this, you see this letter I. And if you got this question wrong, maybe it's because you have no idea what that letter I is. Isn't that crazy? Normally we deal with all these real numbers. You know, we're always talking about what real number, what's the real, what's rational, what's all this. Remember this? Real, rational, irrational, wholes, integers, all that stuff. On the side of all this, next to all these real numbers, we have what are called imaginary numbers. What? Imaginary numbers. What is an imaginary number? Can you think of a number that is imaginary? That's really hard to do. But if you know this one thing, if you know that we can't take the square root of a negative number, what two numbers that you multiply get a negative 1? 1 times 1 is 1. Negative 1 times negative 1 is 1. Negative 1 times 1 is negative 1, but that's not the square root because they're not the same number. So what we do as mathematicians, if we just create this crazy letter and say it's an imaginary, let's just say it's I is an imaginary number. I is equal to the square root of 1. So then if I is equal to the square root of 1, negative 1, I'm sorry, there's one interesting thing about that. Anytime we take the square root of a number, so the square root of 4 is 2, anytime we square that number, we always get what we took the square root of, right? So then that means if we square I, we would get negative 1? That is weird. It's an imaginary. That's a weird fact. That's weird. Why is I squared negative 1? That's because it's defined that way, because we said I is equal to the square root of negative 1. It's just the way it is. So now let's tackle our question, now that you have at least some idea what I is. So now we're looking at I, so now let's look at what are the different choices for I. So if we go to I to the 0, because x can be any number, so I to the 0, well, we know all numbers to the 0 power are 1. Okay, we got that. What about I to the first power? Well, that's just kind of weird. That's just the square root of negative 1. That doesn't really make much sense. But what about I squared? Okay, now that starts to make some sense here. So we're talking about I squared, so that's negative 1. So I squared is negative 1. So now looking at our answer choices, we could have 0, we could, so it's 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? Okay, so let's just keep going on. So let's say I to the 4th power, because I to the, we'll just do I to the 3rd power. So now we have I to the 3rd power, so now it's negative 1 times the square root of negative 1. That's weird, that's not an answer choice. So now let's go I to the 4th power. I'm all messy over here. I'm throwing it out everywhere, right? So this is I to the 3rd power, and I'm trying to make it a little more clear, legible. So I to the 4th power, so that's I squared times I squared. And what did we say I squared was? Is negative 1 times negative 1. So now this is 1. Boom. That's one of our answer choices. So it could be 1. It could never get to 2, because now if you think about it, every time we add on I squared, you're adding on a negative 1. So it's either going to alternate between negative 1 and then positive 1, negative 1 and positive 1. And those are really your only two choices that you have, positive 1 or negative 1. So hopefully you understand now about imaginary numbers. That's what they wanted you to ask. I wanted you to understand. Good.